Hello, welcome to our season finale of Going Online, Reimagining Teaching and Learning. I'm your host, Professor Claire Macken, Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Teaching and Learning in the College of Business and Law at RMIT University. And thank you for joining us, whether you've been here for all 6 sessions or just dropping in for the first time today. So you can look back at our wonderful series. Today we're recording and you'll find Texas privacy policy at texas.gov.au privacy on the screen. So also right now, I'm sure that you, our audience, are situated in many different places around Australia. I'm in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on, the Wurundjeri people. It's also important to acknowledge all the lands you're on. We acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to their cultures, country and elders, past, present and emerging. So I'm not sure where you were when it became apparent that the default mode of learning for everyone in Australia in 2020 would be fully online. And I was in a meeting and I was thinking, how is the education sector going to actually manage this one? And unsurprisingly, what we've learnt through this series is that educators and learners have managed absolutely beautifully. Online learning is not new, and I think many of our providers are online providers as well, but overnight adoption at scale is. Educators and institutions such as yours has had to adopt new approaches that challenge traditional approaches to learning, engagement and assessment. And in our discussions in this series, we've seen so many wonderful things. It makes me wonder about the future of online learning, what it will look like and when and how we will blend and why. What, after all, is the role of a campus? I also wonder, and I see this in some of the comments, maybe we have a little bit romanticised the pre-COVID period to a past of students sitting in the front row of lectures, fully engaged in face-to-face learning. Was that actually ever the case? In terms of COVID-19, amongst the sadness and disbelief and concern we've had for our individual and collective well-being as a society during this time, I think there's a sense of profound optimism. And the disruption needed for learning for the future is fully here, now, today, and tangible. And there's so many opportunities to embrace it, as the discussion in this series have shown. And we have the opportunity to address some seriously wicked problems and to celebrate the innovations occasioned by this unanticipated circumstance. Over the last 5 weeks, we have seen your passion as educators and participants in the higher education system and address so many issues with online learning. And today, I'd love you to participate again. I would love you to ask questions, but also can you jump in with your comments and reflections of the topic of going online, reimagining teaching and learning. We really want to hear from you. You can start posting right now. And today it is such a pleasure to welcome back 2 experts who started the series on the first day with me. They've been here all the way in the background, Dr. Adonopoulos and Dr. Dawn Gilmore. James is the Academic Dean at Kaplan Business School and Kaplan Professional and serves as a Director on the National Board of Independent Higher Education Australia. And Dawn is the Director of Teaching and Learning at RMIT Online. You may recall her face and name from the LinkedIn series, Your Content is Online, What's Next? She is passionate about taking an evidence-based approach to teaching, learning and student success. And we have something special today. Last week on LinkedIn, the amazing Lucy Blakemore, maybe bring up that slide if you could, totally impressed us with this time-lapsed view of her live mind mapping us. And so today we've asked her to do it again, so Lucy Blakemore, and we'll post it at the end after she completes the mind map. Thanks, Lucy, that is such an awesome skill. I'm actually famous for scribbling completely messy drawings, so I'm so in awe and grateful you could join us today in this last session. So today I'm going to ask Dawn and Joyce a question, a big picture question, and we would love your comments and what you've learnt, what's your experiences of online, and any questions, of course, please post them to the chat and we'll go to those shortly. So start asking your questions. So first up, the question is for James. And the question I have for you, James, is what are your reflections of our webinar series?
Thanks very much, Claire. Once I share my reflections, I would also love to hear yours, in fact. But I think I've drawn, say, 4 or 5 different conclusions from everything we've heard over the past 5 weeks. The first one for me has been the distinction between reluctant learners and willing learners online. I think what we've experienced over the past few months is the need to engage reluctant learners online, less so willing learners. I, for example, have done all of my degrees online. So for me, I'm a willing, eager, keen online learner. The challenge for us has been when you have students who do not wish to learn online, who see it as inferior, as less value, how then do you get them engaged to attend, to buy into the learning process, and to ultimately be an advocate for the institution, even though for a period of time they don't have as much access to the campus facilities, for example, as say on-campus students do. That was the first theme that arose for me, which led to the second one, which is basically that a challenge many of us face is that we think that the online teaching model, the online teaching process, is one that is different to the on-campus one. And I tend to disagree based upon what we've heard over the past 5 weeks. I think the most foundational, the most basic practices, the pedagogies that determine effective classroom-based teaching on campus are just as effective online. As long as you have a teacher who is teaching, who is educating as opposed to lecturing, who knows that in order to engage students, you have to bring them into the conversation, you have to ask questions, you have to run activities, you've got to connect in some kind of meaningful way. And this links back to one of the ideas that I shared in the first webinar, which was the 10-minute rule. To talk longer than 10 minutes is extremely disengaging, irrespective of whether a student is looking at you through a monitor or in a physical-based classroom. The third thing for me is exhaustion. We've seen so many studies come out just in the past, say, 4 months or so, which reveal what many of us have known to be true for a long time, which is that it is more exhausting for all of us, whether you're a student or a teacher, to be staring at a screen all day, whether that's a Microsoft Teams-based screen or a Zoom screen. It is more mentally exhausting. And so the need to break that up with frequent activities or regular breaks, I think, is essential in order to maintain a connected and engaged audience. And the final thing for me, what really was the need to train the educators, less so on how to use technology and more so on how to present themselves in a way that's engaging. So is their lighting right? Is their framing right? Is their voice projection good? Are they able to see each of their students and be able to connect with them? These are the factors that I think are most essential when teaching effectively online that I've taken away over the past 5 weeks.
Thanks, James. Love it. And you asked my opinion. I think it comes down to people needing people and connecting with others. And I think that the most disengaged learning experience I've ever had in my life was sitting in a lecture where the lecturer was bent over a civil procedure textbook, so in law, and was reading out every single word of it. And I remember just staring at his part line thinking, it's so straight. How did that happen? Does he have a template for his part line? And so when you think about it in terms of online, the need to have great facilitation, people that you can feel you can connect with, and isn't that the same wherever we are and whichever circumstance we're in? So Dawn, over to you, same question. What are your reflections on our webinar series?
Thanks, Claire. So I guess I'll talk about, so I'll start with the biggest acknowledgement, which is that our sector does not exist in a vacuum. It never has. So what we have in front of us is a near future and future proofing. So when I think about it in those terms, I think about how the Chief Health Minister, Brett Sutton, said pandemics usually come on average every 25 years. And in the future, the near future, we're looking at that being more like every 10 years. And if we look at the current events as we all are coming out of lockdown, and we see in Victoria, McDonald's workers suddenly had to snap back into self-isolation. Meat plants have had to do that. Aged care facilities have had to do that. And with students returning in K through 12, there have been a few schools that have also had to snap back into lockdown. So to me, both the near future and future proofing comes with an opportunity to have a paradigm shift. And what that might be is a designing online first and asking ourselves what's the value we add where we come together synchronously using tools or where we come together face to face. So for years we've been asking, how do we adapt face to face to online? How do I move my content online? These were the major questions that came out over the last 6 weeks and came out in other spaces as well. So face to face was the default. But future normal requires us to flip that paradigm and make online the default so that our sector can be more agile. And it also requires us to design online first and stake our claims with where we're going to add the value from our facilitation and the value of what groups can accomplish together. So I think week after week, we've illustrated in the webinar principles of best practice that continue to exist regardless of our modality, essentially. You know, Belinda Tynan talked about assessment principles, using question banks, applying authentic and realistic assessment by creating assessments that require students to personalize and contextualize their content. Modality isn't the priority when we start thinking like that. The design is. The student environment was another topic that came up week after week. We still have the option and the opportunity to bring our students' environments to life, to personalize through interacting in their landscapes of practice. David Bowser reminded us of this. For example, just because you're teaching ecology online doesn't mean that the students can't go to their local neighborhood and map out the fauna in a nearby space. Another one that I think was brought up week after week was this concept of learning. I think sometimes we confuse both the modality and ways of learning with student preferences. And this was highlighted in last week's webinar and actually captured in the bottom left-hand corner of Lucy Blackmore's mind map. These are student preferences. So when we start to debate which is better, online or face-to-face, I don't know if we have to debate that because ultimately our students' preferences will give us the insight to that. But it's about the experience that we're curating for our students. And I think if there's one more point that I'll end on, I think week after week there were questions that almost wanted to define engagement, and it often meant trapping our students in the LMS so we could see that they were doing something. But all the examples show us that they don't need to learn there. They need you to have designed an experience that facilitates learning in their world. So how do we tap into the students' world going forward over and over again? And I think if there was one question to keep asking ourselves, it would be, what are we designing online first? And how does this cross boundaries into students' worlds?
Yeah, I love that advice, Dawn, and totally agree. And I think that we have to remind ourselves that the obligation that we have as educators is to set the conditions for learning engagement. Guys, I'd love you in the audience. Hi, please post your comments. What have you found? Give us something to comment on. Give us some questions around your experiences with online. Have you found it super hard? What's been some great experiences that you've had? What hasn't worked so well? Have you found that it is completely different to what you were doing before? Will it change your approach in the future? So a question related to that is for James, and it's, what is your best online learning experience?
I might actually go back to when I was myself an undergrad student. Back at Macquarie University, I was studying political science, and I remember first of all of my degrees, as mentioned, were online, as was this one. And what made this one particular lecturer really stand out for me and my colleagues was that he brought performance into the online experience. So, for example, when he would talk about, say, Paul Keating taking over Bob Hawke, he wouldn't just say that Paul Keating took over Bob Hawke. He would say Paul Keating took a knife and stabbed Bob Hawke in the back, and when he stabbed him not just once but repeatedly, and he's making this theatrical experience, which means that what is ordinarily quite a dull experience for many learners online became this performance. And I think that's a really important thing, because it links to the engagement, the engagement and the connection between the teacher, the educator, and the person on the other side of the screen. And I emphasize that word, that noun, person, because that is who is on the other side of the screen, which is why I think the lesson from that experience and any others that I've seen where online learning has worked well has been one where we do see the person on the other screen, on the other side of the screen, which means compassion, essentially, for their situation. Oftentimes, especially if they're international students, they're sharing not just a house or an apartment with several other people, but a bedroom with other people. So they've got objects and things and distractions all around them, which are affecting not just their online learning experience, but also the way in which they're able to complete their assessments on time. So the more that we understand that and report and respond to it accordingly, I think the more effective our online education will be.
Thanks, James. I can totally appreciate that, having 3 children, 2 dogs, and constant distractions in my background. So I'm going to go to Dawn now. A question from the audience. What do you think the frontline teaching staff will say about the experience?
Well, I can tell we've gotten a lot of positive feedback where it's for as cautious or hesitant as staff were with moving online and working from home. I think that they feel equally cautious and nervous about returning back to face-to-face. So I think, I mean, more about what I think, it's more about what I hope they say. I mean, I think I hope they say, I want to learn more about this. I want to get better at this. And I hope that the university responds with the right training so that we can guide them and help them in achieving that goal, because that would be the best experience for everyone. But Claire, you work in a large faculty. What's your vibe on that?
Yes, I think that I mean, the future is clearly going to depend on the learners' expectations and needs with online learning. And if you think about it, the normal online learner, a 32-year-old person with 1.8 children statistically, and they're working full-time and they're studying full-time, and they're usually looking for confirmation of their experiences so that they can retain their current position. It's a very different sort of learner from, you know, an undergraduate student looking for higher education. And I think that a lot of the discussion that we've had over the last 5 weeks has had a comment around the sort of experiences that students thought they were getting from coming to Australia as an international student or going to university as a young person, which is really different from the normal sort of online learner. And Dawn, I'm actually going to throw back to you on that topic, because I know that your work is fully online and you deal with these learners each day. What do you see the characteristics of an online learner?
So the characteristics of the online learners that we have is that they usually are working full-time. They have other commitments such as family, and mostly female, age 28 to 35. And what this means for us is that we have to be inherently empathetic. So for example, at the drop of a hat, we might have a learner who has to go to a mine in northern Queensland and needs an assessment extension. So we were used to responding to things like that. And what we found with the move online was often teachers were taken back when students needed extensions for things that when we were face-to-face wouldn't have been approved. And that was a challenge that our newly moved online remote teachers had, where we could advise and help to meet halfway. But yeah, our online students are extremely competitive, extremely competent, and really interactive and engaged with their learning. And that doesn't always mean that they're logging in and posting to discussion boards. It means that they get to often apply it on the job in real-time scenarios, and they bring that back to discussion boards, and they bring that back to case studies for assessments that they might be submitting.
Thanks, Dawn. I've got a question. It actually has been asked a few times, and it's around the value of online learning. And the perception, I think, from some of the discussion we've had over the last 5 weeks is that online learning should somehow be a different cost to face-to-face learning or blended learning. And it's a big issue in the sector, and I think some of the conversation with international students at the moment has a similar threat, is that, well, I'm not coming to Australia, I'm not living in Australia, I'm not having the experience that I thought I would have. I should have a discount on my fees. So James, over to you. Do you think that online courses will bring fees down?
I think the answer is yes, absolutely. They must come down, but not because of reduced quality in teaching, right? So if as institutions we make a commitment that by teaching online, the teaching itself stays at a high level, then there's no issue. The fees can remain the same. The only reason why they should go down and must go down if the students are receiving less in value. And they're definitely receiving less in value if, by virtue of studying online, they've got less access to borrowing library books. They've got less access to student counsellors or career advisors. They've got less access to quiet study spaces or computer labs or Wi-Fi. They've got less access, for example, to consultations with their lecturer outside of the normal lecture or tutorial. So if that is the case, and they're receiving an inferior service compared to those students who are studying on campus, then it's only fair. It's only fair that their fees are lower. But if it's possible for them to maintain access to all of that stuff and still get a good quality education, then there is absolutely no reason why the fees should be reduced at all. What do you think?
I think it's an interesting question, actually, James, that not everyone in the sector would agree on that analysis. Although, if price is the indication of quality, by lowering price, the conversation might be that you're getting something less online. And I think that's not necessarily the case. I think you can have extremely high quality education online, as well as in face-to-face. And in response to the earlier question around your best online learning experience, I did an MBA fully online, and the engagement that was present with this syndicate group that I was in, working for one of the Big Four consultants as an experiential learning project, where we were up till all hours of the morning online, having discussions and developing solutions for a presentation. Highly engaging and completely different from the experience in my law degree with that lecture I mentioned earlier with the part line. And just a comment from Emma, thank you for posting your experience. If anyone else would love to post on the chat, what's worked for you? What hasn't worked? What have you learned? What's your reflections? Emma says, I've enjoyed using video and drawing apps online to enable discussion and collaborative work in mini groups. I'd love to hear more. What an awesome thing. One of the questions with a few likes on it is for Dawn. So how do we move to the second wave of the development of online learning? Over to you, Dawn.
I think that also just on price, it could come down as well, because if we all accept that online learning might be a more dominant mode in the future, we could see competition bring the prices down. Just something to consider. But in terms of what the second wave looks like, so if you think about how we all scurried and we got online as fast as we could, as best that we could, the next phase is going to be about creating a shared practice in your institution. So And the purpose of creating a shared practice, I think, will be so that students can be dropped into any course and still feel a sense of belonging, a sense of familiarity, and that can help with their learning experience. It can help with retention. So, and sometimes that looks as easy as introducing a template so that all the courses have the same look and feel, and introducing a shared teaching practice so that when a student goes from one teacher to the next, they're getting a similar experience, and their expectations then can be met before they even enter the classroom. So some of the things that we do to bring a similar teaching experience is, we make sure that every students are greeted with a message and a video from their teacher, so that their classroom is humanized on day one. They're not walking into an empty online classroom. Another way that we create a shared process is through our assessment feedback. We have a very specific process that all of our teachers use so that students, no matter when they submit an assessment into any course, they know what sort of feedback to expect, and then it helps our teachers talk about what to do with that feedback. And they get this sort of reinforcement and these feedback loops built into every interaction that they have with a staff member, regardless of the course that they're studying in. So it'll be really exciting for universities to talk about, what does our shared practice look like? What do you want it to look like? And maybe even pull in the student voice. So, bring in a student panel. What do the students want the shared practice to look like? Because it's the interactions with them that make the shared practice possible. So I think the second wave is the exciting part.
Thanks, Dawn. I hope so too. And just a comment from Adrian was, I love being online, but the credit really goes to students that have risen to the challenge. Undergraduate students that didn't make it to Australia but are still up at 3:30 a.m. their time every week. And just personal experience was, my own son, age 20, was studying in the US and had to come home. So he was up at 3:30 a.m. as well, and he was very kind to wake up the entire household. So another comment from Christian, we have had the experience of a particular student with a range of learning challenges, but we've found that this student's engagement and learning has significantly improved in the online environment. So it leads nicely on to the next question, also from you in the audience, and keep your posts coming. We absolutely love them always. So James, what about less self-directed students and students who are at risk? Do you think we're going to see attrition rise, and what do we do about this?
I think we'll see attrition rise regardless, just because of COVID-19 consequences, with many students having lost employment this year and being unable to pay their tuition fees, thereby not being able to continue with their studies. So I think we'll see for the rest of this year anyway a rise in attrition. But when I think of at-risk students, I don't differentiate between those who are online or those who are on campus. I don't differentiate between those who are self-directed and those who are really who are the complete opposite. I just look at students who are at risk, full stop. And that means, what are we doing then to make sure that they are rescued before it's too late? That requires a greater amount of intervention. Now, sure, the kind of intervention might be a little bit different because they happen to be studying online, but the extent of intervention shouldn't really be different at all. They're still at-risk students. So, for example, if someone is at risk, the first thing I would do is say, have they accessed the learning management system? Or have they not accessed it? And if they haven't, I would use that to prompt a telephone call or an email or a text message or something to find out whether the student is okay. Has the student not submitted their first assessment? If they've missed that first assessment, we know that they will almost certainly fail the subject unless someone calls them and gives them an extension or a reason to continue. Have they been absent from the online classes, which means it's critical then to make sure that we're taking, that we're recording attendance, for example, and that we can see who the students are on the screen. And something else that we've trialed in my institution has been, and by the way, as an institution where 97% of students are international, we've arranged for staff members who speak the students' first language to actually call them before the study period begins to connect with them, because we feel that human-to-human connection from someone who is similar to them in terms of cultural background will help to get them engaged from the very beginning, thereby limiting the extent of attrition throughout the study period. What's worked in your institution?
Thanks, James. Our little lag today, it's quite strange today. So I've got some comments as well from the audience and a bit of fan mail for James. Great to hear our MQ academics impressed you, James, smiley face. There was a question from, so I'll just pull it up. Sorry, I'll just get it. Oh, Dawn, question for you. What do you think students will say about the transitional experience to online at the end of semester?
So interestingly, The Guardian put out a survey asking students how has lockdown affected your final year of university, but it got a lot of traction of students then responding to this. This was on Twitter, their tweet with lots of feedback about their experience instead of responding to the survey. And one of the themes in the responses were just how human their teachers are. And I think this relates to last week where there was a quote that, you know, online is more human, more face-to-face than human. I don't know, something like that. Anyway, I wanted to share this student quote. It said, the academic staff have never been more human. Their communication is personable and genuine, and their love of teaching, despite all the obstacles, really shines through. I feel more supported by them as a whole person, not just as a student. It's refreshing. So, I mean, that you couldn't get much better feedback than that. But I think that, you know, and there was just like another one I can wholeheartedly relate. My amazing tutors continue to inspire and challenge me and have surpassed my expectations during this transition. So, I mean, the feedback will be mixed because of learning preferences, right? And because of everybody's individual experiences. But I think that there are a lot of good news stories in here. And it'll be about surfacing them and then putting them into practice and getting the most out of. So, you know, who was praised for being a human in the classroom, and how can we copy or learn from that teacher so that that can become, again, part of our shared practice.
Thanks, Dawn. And I've got a question for James, following up from the previous conversation. You can either compete on cost or quality. Can you see a scenario where excellent online courses have higher fees than face-to-face in the future? And I'm going to give you two questions because I know that you can handle it. So how do you think teaching and student experience quality measures will need to change in the future?
Okay, so the answer to the first question about whether it could be possible for an online course to attract a higher fee than an on-campus course, the answer is yeah, of course. There's no question, really, but only if the perception among students or those who are helping them to make the decision to enroll at a particular institution believe that they're getting greater value out of that online course than they would if the student were to be studying on campus. So, for example, Claire, the scenario that you gave about your experience doing your MBA online, I think it was your MBA online. That to me sounded as though you were getting as much, if not more, value via that online experience than you would have been had you been on campus. So there's no question there at all about the need to reduce fees. You got value for money. But if there's something that happens, for example, students are receiving synchronous versus asynchronous delivery as a result of studying on campus, well, then there is a diminished value for the student. And so there has to be a payoff then in terms of lower course fees or higher course fees if students are getting more from their online experience, such as, for example, in my institution, where if a student is studying online, that all the workshops are recorded and then students are able to access them throughout the entire trimester. Well, that's an added benefit. So we would never even dream of reducing our online course fees because students are getting as much, if not more so, than what on-campus students are receiving. In regards to the second question about student experience quality measures, the one that I'm the biggest fan of is actually quite controversial in academia, which is the Net Promoter Score. And the Net Promoter Score basically just assesses, it evaluates the proportion of students who would say that they would strongly recommend the institution to others as a place to study, versus those who would say the complete opposite. And the Net Promoter Score, if it's in positive territory, means that there are more students willing to recommend the institution than otherwise. And I think this is critical because it's one thing for a student to say, yeah, I'm happy studying here, but it's another thing for them to say, look, I'm so happy studying here that despite receiving criticism, despite receiving grades that are not that great, I still value the learning experience so much that I would want my friends and family to study here too. And there aren't many institutions at all who've adopted this NPS. And I think that's going to be more essential as students are perceived more and more in the future as customers.
Thanks, James. And I've got a comment from Susan. I love James's comment regarding performance. I think this is closely related to storytelling, and this is critical both in face-to-face and online. The role of narrative is powerful, but in the end, good teaching is good teaching, whatever the mode. What a great comment. Love that, Susan. So I've got one more question each quickly, and then I've got you a tricky question to finish. So Dawn, any comments that you have on the question of measuring quality for online learning as discussed by James, and is online learning here to stay?
So, I mean, to me, the ultimate quality piece is has your course does it have constructive alignment? So, if every course should be reviewed for that, and then if it doesn't have it, it would need to be refreshed. I just can't emphasize how important constructive alignment is. So, you know, what are your learning outcomes? What activities and are students being asked to complete to meet those outcomes? And how are the assessments measuring those outcomes? That to me is just the pillar, the end all and be all. And oftentimes in conversations, we'll get teachers asking students to do exercises just for the sake of it, like sometimes group work for the sake of group work when it may not be a learning outcome in the course. So making sure that the right checkpoints are in place from design to review to make sure that that's being met. And then in terms of quality at some of the other things are just making sure that staff have opportunities for continuous improvement, and that those opportunities hopefully trickle down into the classroom, and that there are ways to measure that. For example, the GTS, I know it's controversial, but good teaching scores can often be a tool to start having conversations about the quality of teaching, defining what quality of teaching means to your staff, and making sure that there's, again, the right training in place to pursue that. And absolutely, online learning is here to stay. I mean, all learning is blended. We do face-to-face with a bit of online, and all the online experiences that we design aren't limited to the online environment. So I think it's always important to keep that in mind, that just because we're online doesn't mean that we're limited. What are your thoughts on online learning being here to stay, James and Claire?
Definitely, I have no doubt it's here to stay, and regardless, I mean, blended learning is absolutely the future, but some learners really enjoy learning online and they want that mode, and it's a choice that they make, and one that we've all made in some way. So we're actually coming to a close, and I have such a big question for you to finish, which is, what are your hopes for the future of higher education? And I'm going to tack on, do you think COVID-19 has changed us as a sector? James, over to you.
Okay, it is a big question, and so I'll answer it by saying that it feels that what we've learnt over the past few months is no longer about how to transition to online learning, but how to make it sustainable. And part of the answer to what can make online learning sustainable really comes down to accepting the inevitability of another crisis. Now, earlier, Dawn mentioned research that, you know, another pandemic might be just 10 years away, which I totally agree with. But my PhD research was specifically on crisis leadership. And it was fascinating to discover that on average, every institution, every organisation, whether they're in higher ed or not, goes through an organisational crisis approximately every 5 years. So we have to accept that there is a chance that there'll be either a sector-wide crisis or an institution-based crisis within the next 5 years that could threaten a particular institution's viability. So the question for us becomes, how do we prepare for that? And I think what can get lost in a little bit of this is that the crisis may result in a greater shift towards online learning, but I think we also have to prepare ourselves for the opposite, that the next crisis could be one that threatens online learning, such that suddenly we have to now teach on campus more so than we ever have, which would pose a far greater challenge. I know at my institution, the logistical complexities of transitioning back to on-campus delivery in the context of social distancing regulations is so complex. It's so complex that it's more difficult for us than it was to decide to go completely online. So I think that's important for us moving forward, in deciding how we're going to learn from this, because COVID has changed us, but every single crisis changes us. And I think it's also, as a final point for me to say, that I think we need to get away from referring to the distinction between online learning and face-to-face learning. Because to me, online learning is as much face-to-face learning. The distinction is really online learning versus on-campus learning. Sure, then there's a genuine difference. But I'm considering this as being a face-to-face session because I can see faces and my face can also be seen. And I think the more that we use face-to-face as a distinct term, the more that we're perpetuating this gap, this us and them mentality between the two modalities.
Yeah, I love that. That's awesome. And even though, you know, I can't see all of you sitting there, I feel like we have a connection in this space as well. And I'm going to turn to Dawn with the same question now. So what are your hopes? Looks like our little lag's happening. So James, you might have to do some smiles or something. So what are your hopes for and what do you think about the future of higher ed? Has COVID-19 changed us?
Well, I think COVID-19 has changed us, and as a result of that change, and what I'm hopeful for, is that we start becoming more purposeful about the learning experiences that we're designing. And I think the other piece is that we talk about student centricity, but I hope that this is a monumental moment where we start actually putting that at the forefront of what we're doing. So what does it mean to be student centric? So I think the students came to, you know, they stepped it up just as much as the universities did during this pandemic. As a result of that, how do we make sure that they're always at the front of what we're doing? I know for some teachers, they started looking at students differently. They started thinking about different ways they had to connect with them, what they were saying, how they were saying it. And I don't want that mindset to leave. I hope that that's the mindset that's here to stay. And if we can weave that through everything that we're doing, I think that the price of online or face-to-face won't matter because at the end of the day, it's a learning experience that we can ultimately work with the student to build.
Thanks, Dawn. And I also hope that COVID has changed us. I think COVID has brought out when and how we want to truly have in-person engagement. It looks like our lag's happening again, so that's all cool. We've had the opportunity to really address some wicked problems and, oh, I'm here, hi, it made it across. We can also celebrate all of the wonderful innovations occasioned by this time. And I just want to thank everyone in the audience for whether you've been here just today, you've been at any of the previous ones, or indeed all of our 6 sessions. So it's bringing our session today to a close. And if you've got any other reflections or comments, definitely post them as I'm wrapping us up. You can find all of our webinars on the TEXA website, and you should check out the wonderful resources on there. There's absolutely pure gold in terms of online learning and lots of different things that you can look through. I want to thank everyone who's in the audience, whether today or the whole week. And today I'd like to thank my fellow panelists, Dr. Dawn Gilmore and Dr. James Adonopoulos, not just for today, but they've actually been sitting here every single week behind the scenes, assisting beautifully. Big shout out to the RMIT communications team, Nick Lucas, Sarah, Simone, and our wonderful TEXA collaborators. We've had the best time getting to know you, Emily Good and Karen Trelaw. And thanks from me as well. Farewell from me. I've absolutely loved every Wednesday putting on a suit jacket with my gym pants and sneakers. And I hope I can see you online or in person sometime in the future. And we really hope you have enjoyed going online, reimagining teaching and learning. Goodbye from me.